And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third day of our three-day Thelma Hansen virtual series on climate change and its impacts on Southern California. For those of you who did not attend the previous sessions, my name is Annemiek Schilder, and I am the director of the University of California Cooperative Extension Office in Ventura and the Hansen Agricultural Research and Extension Center in Santa Paula. I just want to give a quick summary of yesterday's session. We first had Dr. Tapan Patak, a climate specialist at UC Merced, who talked about climate change and its impacts on agriculture in California. He talked about increases in temperature that can lower yield, effects on plant physiology like faster ripening, which also could yield to lower yield, result in lower yields, longer and warmer growing seasons, and potentially reduced chilling for crops that require chilling, which could present problems. He also talked about increases in pests and certain diseases, and as you probably know, higher temperatures lead to more generations of pest insects as well. And he talked about programs which are under development to help farmers make decisions in light of climate change. We then had Dr. Ben Faber, who is a soils, water, and subtropical crops advisor in Ventura County, to provide a local perspective. And he talked about what it looks like on the ground, you know, when you have an extreme temperature, what happens to the trees, what are the issues with irrigation. And so that was very enlightening. And then we had Nikki Anderson, who is the community education specialist for the Climate Smart Agriculture Program in Ventura County. And she talked about different programs that are available and funding for farmers who want to use techniques, for instance, in the Healthy Soils program to mitigate climate change and the impacts of it. So today, we're going to talk about fire and how to increase fire resiliency. And we'll have Dr. Max Moritz, an extension specialist based in UC Santa Barbara, who will talk about fire in the wildlands and urban interface. We'll then have Matthew Shapiro, who is our range and livestock advisor in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties, talk about the effects of fire on rangelands and livestock. And then we'll have Dr. Sabrina Drill, who is the Natural Resources Advisor in Ventura and Los Angeles counties, who will speak about fire-resistant homes and landscapes. Nikki Anderson will be our moderator today, so I will pass the baton to Nikki. Thank you.
Thank you, Annemiek, and welcome everyone for the last day. I'm Nikki Anderson, and I would like to begin by stating that I'm speaking on occupied and unceded territory previously stewarded by the Chumash people, and that the original inhabitants of this land are the original leaders in climate smart agriculture, regenerative agriculture. So thank you. I will now introduce our esteemed first speaker, Dr. Max Moritz. He received his PhD in biogeography in 1999 and has been a statewide wildfire specialist with University of California Cooperative Extension since 2004. He is also an adjunct professor at the Bren School of University of California, Santa Barbara. So we're very excited to hear you speak. As I saw in the chat, it's quite good timing, so take it away. You'll have to unmute yourself, please, Matt.
Thank you. No, you're right. I need hold my hand. Okay, thank you for the for those of you that are here listening. Thanks for attending, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. So I come at wildfire from a little bit different perspective. I come from a biogeography background, so it's a little bit different from many of the perspectives of people studying fire. And that, as you may see from the presentation, has sort of influenced a lot of the work. The path of the talk is basically to start off with some research, a research overview, kind of how we think about modeling fire and quantifying the drivers and climate change, but also how through time, looking at development patterns has influenced our thinking in all of that analysis and modeling. And then kind of the latter half of the talk more about some of the solutions, kind of in an extension sense rather than research, how to apply what we're finding to hopefully solve some of our wildland-urban interface problems. And that's how to get a hold of me. I'm Moritz at bren.ucsb.edu. If you want to follow up afterwards, then please do. Okay, so most of the time, if you've heard a talk on fire, and I think you'll see this maybe even today, you have something called the fire behavior triangle, or the wildfire triangle, and that's looking at the characteristics of fuel, characteristics of weather, and of topography to tell you something about the behavior of a given fire. So flame lengths or rates of spread or heat release for a given event. If you zoom out and look at fire over longer time periods and larger spatial scales like this, we now have data for very extensive parts of the planet and over relatively long time periods. Some of us ended up figuring out when we saw data sets like this coming online about 10 years ago that there was a whole new set of questions that we could actually start to ask about fire, the kinds of fires that appear in different parts of the world and why. And so that led to basically the emergence of a whole subdiscipline, which ended up being called pyrogeography. So that's the study of the patterns of fire and what controls them, different kinds of fire and what their effects are. And that's been really essential for us to look at and to use as a framing set of concepts to look at climate change. When we think about fire happening over and over in landscape, we think about fire regimes, right? Cyclical fires of different kinds. And we can boil down the drivers to a couple of key bins or a couple of key categories. The first is what drives the fuel amount, the fuel accumulation rates, basically environmental constraints on biomass productivity. There has to be resources they're growing to burn. And what is it in the biophysical sense that affects how fast that accumulates and what the characteristics are? There has to be a window in time in which that stuff is flammable, right? So what are the variables that control the length and severity of the fire season? Because you have places that have plenty of fuel. They're not fuel limited necessarily, but they may have very narrow windows in time in which that's flammable, and vice versa. And then also, how do those conditions coincide with patterns of ignitions, right? Because you have to have something to start the fire. So these three bins of controls, we've kind of put together in a conceptual framework, and how they come together in different parts of the landscape tells us the kinds and the frequencies of fire that we're likely to see there. So we've used that idea to look at climate change. Early on, the conventional wisdom about climate change came largely from one publication. This was back in, I think it was 2006. We had a really influential paper which looked at fire activity across the Western US. And the bottom line, the gist of this study was that the black lines here in this bottom figure are the spring temperatures, basically, at higher elevation forested landscapes. And the red bars are fires. And the big finding of this paper, one of the big findings, was that warming temperatures through greenhouse gas, anthropogenic greenhouse gas contributions, warming spring temperatures were leading to increasing fire. And that the mechanism there was warming spring meant earlier snow melt at these higher elevations. And with earlier snow melt, you had an earlier start to the dry down during the summer hot, dry season. And you had a longer fire season in which you could have longer, or rather more and larger fires. Well, many of us were starting to wonder, okay, what about other ecosystems? What about lower elevation forests? What about shrublands? What about other parts of the world where fires are controlled by different things? How consistent will the mechanisms be driving fire activity due to climate change? And so to study that particular problem, my my group and some others that were interested in statistical modeling adopted a framework from another field, basically. If you think about fire as having some sort of suitable range of conditions, and in the center here where things are very fire prone, and then marginal conditions on the shoulders where it's either too cold or wet or too hot or arid. To some of you, this might look like a niche, right? Where populations are going to maximize their reproductive success in different environmental conditions. And so basically, species distribution modeling was adopted to apply to this problem. About 15 years ago, this was being used widely to look at range shifts of different organisms under climate change or extinction risk. We realized that this framework actually worked very well, both in the ideas and also in the statistics for fire distribution modeling. So we adopted this and had some success. We started off looking at global patterns. This is just it's a longer term data set, about a decade's worth of fires, similar to that first animated global image that you saw. We looked at how often fire was occurring in different parts of the planet, and then the environmental conditions that were related to places that were burning more often, and we could build fire models using these data sets. From those models, this is kind of a complicated slide, and I apologize. The only point I want to make here is that different parts of the world we started finding were controlled by different climate variables. So these variables down at the bottom here, the darkest green is net primary productivity, then precipitation annually, precipitation in the driest month, temperature seasonality, temperature in the wettest month, temperature in the warmest month. But suffice it to say, in different biomes, we had different variables popping out, emerging as important, or mixtures of variables that were important in different biomes, because fire is controlled by different things in different areas. So we learned a lot about what seems to control fire in different areas, the sensitivities from these initial studies. We're also able to project fire forward into the future. Say, for example, this was 16 global climate models that we used. And we took the mean of all of those future projections, and in the near term, we projected it out, and then in the far term, the end of century. And so you start to see the patterns show up if you use an ensemble model mean set of projections. We also we adopted kind of the approach that the IPCC started using, which was looking at model agreement. How many of the future global climate models indicate that fire will even show an increase versus a decrease in any given area? And so those are the projections from some of our early studies. And it's remarkable that in the near term, in the next few decades, over half the world, based on the projections at the time, we didn't even really know if there would be an increase or a decrease likely in fire proneness in those areas. And the patterns become much more pronounced here in panel D as you go further and further out. From all these studies, like I said, we got an idea of kind of how to think about fire, what seems to constrain it, and we came up with this other set of constraints, basically that there's a dominant first order gradient of fire frequencies to productivity, and it has this kind of hump-shaped response, right? In very, very low productivity areas, the deserts, we don't have any fire, right? There's not much to burn, and then with a little bit of productivity, you rapidly increase fire activity, and then it levels off. There's a long, flat, moderately high productivity range where you don't, it's relatively flat. And then it drops down at the end in our very high productivity tropical and temperate rainforest areas. But along that gradient, you have limiting factors that will bump fire activity in any given place up or down, sensitivities that will bump fire activity here versus there, up or down. And this is, again, has helped us understand which variables we want to choose for our models, and how to understand what's happened in the past and what might be likely in the future. In addition to looking at ensembles, like just taking the mean, Another way is to use a warm, wet future versus a warm, dry future. And from this, for example, we learned that in the Mediterranean basin, which is kind of similar to California in its Mediterranean climate, the Mediterranean basin under a warmer, drier future, the southern portions of the basin are going to see less fire, and the northern portions of the basin are going to see more fire, right? The more mesic areas, the more wet areas are going to see more fire as they dry out, and the places that are already hot and dry, as they get even drier, will probably see productivity go down and actually fire activity go down too. Now, at those very broad scales, right, 50 to 100 kilometer grid cells, we didn't actually have human activity. We didn't have humans in the models, right? Climate told the vast majority of the story and allowed us to make historical and future projections that were reasonable, that were plausible, and they told the climate change story in a sensible way. But what we found as you go to finer scales, and here's a map of California, somewhat outdated map, but it's about several decades of fires in orange over the different colored ecoregions of the state. As you drill down to project fire at a finer scale, we've done this at California, or at a 1 kilometer resolution for California, you find that you can't leave humans out. Human activity, roadedness, development densities, the power line infrastructure, right? We've had a lot of concern in the last couple of years over the influence of the utility network and its roles in fire. You have to put these anthropogenic factors into the models, or you actually are not getting very reasonable results. Now, this has kind of forced a more appropriate and holistic look at these systems, and sometimes we call these coupled human natural systems, sometimes we call them socio-ecological systems. But the gist of it is pretty simple. It's that we have natural ecosystems here, and in this graphic, it's just one way of depicting fire operating on various landscapes, and we have humans living on those landscapes, right? And where we all come together is the wildland-urban interface. That's where we have our home losses and our many of our public health and safety concerns. But this framework actually works well with this idea that even in our modeling, even in our quantitative modeling, we have to take this same approach to understanding the situation. So one of the things we've been able to do with these models is break them into kind of bins of the biophysical contribution to the fire activity projections versus the anthropogenic contribution. We've learned some interesting things through doing this. Here's an example from a few years ago, and we're refitting these models right now. From a few years ago, creating models for California, and this shows the importance of the biophysical variables in driving the model up and down the state. And then here's the human contribution. And one of the interesting things you see about the human contribution is it can be positive or negative, right? And that was a really important finding from this particular study. It corroborates, it supports results that others have found. But it also showed us that at least using the variables that we were examining, the anthropogenic forcing, the human dimensions, the variables that represented our development and our impact on the landscape, were as important as many of the climate variables in driving the fire patterns, right? So in moving forward, we know that we need to get the various climate projections involved and used in our projections, but we also need future land development patterns, because they, in many areas, are just as important in driving the model as the climate variables. So it's an important insight from a research perspective, but it's also really important from a policy and planning perspective. It shows us that we have a huge set of decisions that we can actually use to affect our own future fire proneness on the landscape. This positive and negative relationship of fire to human development, here's one representation of that. It has kind of a consistently hump-shaped response. It's more or less pronounced depending on the area that we're looking at in California. But the basic story is there's some background level of fire on most landscapes. And as you develop this landscape, as you put more people on it, you have more ignitions, right? You're supplying more ignitions. And so therefore you're having more fires. You continue to develop up to some peak where you plateau. And then as you continue to develop that landscape, fire activity ends up going down, right? You fragmented up the landscape to a point that, contiguous expanses of fuels are less common. You have organized fire suppression, and culturally, you have some shifts, right? You don't necessarily burn the leaves in your yard anymore, or you're more aware that fire in a built environment is something that can be pretty tragic. So this hump-shaped response is fairly generic, and it's been shown probably to operate in many parts of the world. And it's also forced us to go back to our framing, our conceptual models, and say, all right, well, there's in each of these three wings of this fire regime triangle, there's both anthropogenic and biophysical components that we need to take into account and model, if we can, get them into our models for the most realistic projections that we can make. Another example of this, just just in case this happens to be closer to home, this is the Bay Area. Here's the biophysical variables, and here's the human effect in that same area. So basically, yeah, making the point that how we develop these landscapes not only defines our exposure to fire, right? Because it really defines where we're going to put the homes and the communities, but it also feeds back to affect fire probabilities and hazard itself. All right, we've had the good fortune of actually having these models. This is one of my roles as extension, having these models adopted and used by agencies. So as an example, CAL FIRE is actually using these maps to help guide their avoided emissions program. They offer grants for large-scale fuel projects that can demonstrate that they have the potential for influencing and reducing future emissions from wildfire. And these maps are also potentially going to be used in the new fire hazard severity zone map updates from the state. These are the maps that guide building codes. So all of these have not just research, but really important and interesting applied uses too. I think it's probably just as important to say what we don't have in these, what we still need to do better. We have yet to have very good maps of extreme weather, right? And we all know that the hot, dry wind events that cause most of our worst fires and our worst losses are one of the things we really care about. Well, we don't have good maps of extreme weather, of wind corridors to use in our models. This is from a publication now about 15 years ago, I think, maybe 12, where we mapped out Santa Ana wind intensities across Southern California, right? We don't have good maps like this for Santa Ana events, for Diablo winds up north, for sundowner winds in the Santa Barbara area, for mono winds in the Sierras. And so as these types of data come available, we will be very eagerly plugging them into future models. We don't have a good idea of how climate change is going to affect wind patterns either. So future remaining challenges, future wind patterns are one. Interannual variability and extremes. So most of the models that we've been talking about use long-term averages for these various climate variables, right? But we know that year-to-year swings in different variables are important, in different ecosystems, right? Especially the extremes, whether it be extreme wind events or, you know, epic droughts, or like last year, heat waves that coincide with rashes of lightning strikes. These are all very unusual events that end up really having a big impact, and we don't have good data sets for those yet to plug into our models. At least in part, historically, we could do a better job of trying to recreate those conditions with models, but also there's the ability of the global climate models themselves to realistically project that future variability and the sequencing in time, the year-to-year sequencing of that variability, how it manifests itself. We need to have better representations of that from the modelers, from the climate modeling environment or community to plug into our models. Human development, I mentioned, it can be as influential on future fire frequencies as the biophysical variables. So we need a whole suite of human development projections to use for scenarios. And process versus statistical modeling. Really, one of the best ways to project where future vegetation patterns are going to be is using what we would call dynamic process-based models that can use the different vegetation types and their pathogens, their responses to fire, and so on. And we really don't have as many of those as we would like to understand where vegetation types are going to end up. Here's an example of the Sierras and one particular study where we had these transition probabilities from different plant communities, mostly marching uphill, up higher and higher in elevation as it became warmer and possibly more as evaporative demand and drought stress increased at the lower elevations. Studies like this were just based on climate. It didn't have fire in it. So we really need better models for projecting veg transitions and the interaction with fire, so we can get a more realistic picture of where we should be doing restoration or where we should be maybe facilitating some of these transitions. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and talk more about some of the applied and extension types of questions and challenges we face with fire. And I really think that the way we talk about fire is part of the problem. We often talk about, the fire problem or the wildfire crisis. And I think by binning it into one generic beast, we're really missing a lot of the nuance, and we're talking past each other frequently. And we have to be much more careful about how we define the problem that we're trying to fix, basically. And I think this really does boil down to being more specific about what it is we're actually worried about, and so that we are kind of operating from a set of shared assumptions. Now, there's a narrative that I use sometimes to represent this problem and how we need to be more specific, and it goes something like this. I hear this narrative from colleagues, from journalists, politicians, my next door neighbor, and it goes something like this, right? We have increasing fire proneness and fire activity because of climate change, and there's plenty of studies to kind of support that assertion, and that increasing fire proneness is actually going to lead to more fire and more severe fire for our forests, and there's definitely science supporting that link. Which will then in turn drive more home losses. And this is where I think some of us studying these problems say, hold on, time out, that we might not want to jump there so quickly. But the conversation keeps going to, well, with more home losses, the more and more potential for these real disasters, right? This is Coffee Park and the Tubbs fire where, we basically had an urban conflagration come through a neighborhood from the wildlands into the wildland urban interface. And I think to make progress on these problems, I think it's really important to step back and examine this this narrative and ask whether it really is a causal chain of events and impacts, because what do we see when we look at many of these environments where homes have actually burned? What's common here, despite the differences between, this is the Angora fire in 2007 in Tahoe versus Coffey Park a few years ago. What we often see in many of these environments where we have a lot of home losses, here again is another example of this from Paradise just a couple years ago. We see that the homes have burned and the vegetation around the homes is still green, right? And this is actually fairly common in post-burn environments where we've lost a lot of homes. And it tells us something really important. It tells us that many of these homes burned from embers coming from relatively far away, not from the forest burning right next to them necessarily. Embers blowing in from far away under wind-driven events, and then the homes become the fuel. The homes ignite and drive the wildfire through the neighborhood. So first of all, it's not necessarily the forest burning right adjacent to the home that's igniting the homes. It's wind-driven embers, and then the homes become the fuel. And secondly, most of these home losses are not even really in the environments that we would consider traditional forests, right? These are wildland urban interface areas that are not, classic mixed conifer forests. So basically, this narrative is kind of a broken narrative, and the logic doesn't hold up. And it's important for us to be careful how we talk about this, because I would argue it really boils down to which problem we're trying to solve. We have a forest loss problem out there, right? Climate change is making more extreme droughts, pests, and wildfires, bringing those into these forested systems. And it's a serious problem. And this is a land management and fire and fuel management set of concerns that we have to grapple with. And this is different from our home loss problem, right? This is not a forest fire problem, but this is one of where and how we build our communities. This is one where the solutions lie in land use and urban planning, right? The solutions that apply to the forest loss problem, prescribe burning in certain areas, or thinning out the fuels, restoring fire to these systems, or thinning out the forests or fuels. It's much harder to get prescribed fire into urbanized areas. We're not there. It's possible, but we're not there. We can't thin the fuels necessarily. In many of these cases, the homes are the fuels, right? So this is a different set of problems and a different set of solutions. And again, it comes down to a land use and urban planning set of opportunities. Home losses, to make the point even more bluntly, it's not a function of fire behavior in the traditional sense, right? Of flame lengths, rates of spread, and fire intensity. If we look at an IPCC kind of framing of the problem, it's not just the hazard, right? It's not just the flame lengths and the rates of spread. It's the exposure. It's where and how we built, and it's how those structures were put together. Do they have wood roofs? Do they have ember vulnerable vents, and so on? All that comes together to give us our risk, and we're learning more and more about this. And if we look at the role, the scale of planning decisions, of urban planning decisions, we have a variety of scales from the home out to the whole community. But I often hear the assertion that better building codes would just solve this home loss problem, right? Well, the issue here is that building codes really apply at the scale of an individual structure, the construction materials and methods of an individual building. And they don't really apply at these broader scales. And these broader scales are actually important, right? This is where housing density and layout starts to become important. Here are the results from a study a couple of years ago led by Alex Seifert, where there were 3 study areas and several fires, individual large fires or complexes of fires that were examined. But from this study, one of the take-home messages was the places where we had home losses, and those are these red bars, the places where we had home losses versus the places where we didn't, and those are the black bars, the density, the housing densities were always lower, right? So housing density in this particular study, housing density turns out to be one of the key indicators of vulnerability and loss, right? So this is beyond just the structure where individual or individual parcels and individual building codes would apply, right? And so we're left with a set of questions and important needs and opportunities at these broader scales. And so I have actually spent some time recently with a colleague looking at that issue with Van Butzik. This is too complicated a table to go through, but suffice it to say that some of the risk reduction measures boiled down to some basic categories. Getting fire professionals involved in urban planning earlier in the conversation, better siting and layout when it comes to designing communities, worrying about redundancies, whether it's public, oh, these are off a little, I apologize, worrying about refuges of last resort and water supplies, and lastly, ignition sources of power lines. So to go into a couple of examples of this, the first and most obvious, this is kind of how we think of floodplain and development. Basically, locating subdivisions in the highest hazard parts of the landscape. We need to avoid that and concentrate development in the least hazardous parts of the landscape. There are actually examples from planning ordinances that specify this. This is from Gaviota. Development shall be sited to minimize exposure to hazard, right? Building sites should be located in an area of lowest fire hazard. So there are precedents for this in ordinances. And if you are a planner and you wanted some tools to actually make decisions like this, we have several different ways of mapping hazard that we could use to help guide these kinds of decisions. But none of this kind of thing is codified across most of the state. Another measure, concentrate the building of homes on the inner side of perimeter roads. A local fire marshal pointed this out to me, that whenever a developer submitted a plan to his office, he sent it back and said, take all the homes off of the outside of this outer perimeter road, right? Wildfire in this situation comes from the wildlands into the community. That way you have a sidewalk, a full road, and another sidewalk as defensible space, and you don't have wildfire coming straight out of the wildlands and into the backyards of many of these homes. Clustering structures. This is a little controversial. A lot of firefighters for years have thought, no, we don't want structures very close together, because if they ignite each other. Well, we now have very, very good building codes and fire resistant construction methodologies. So now clustering structures actually takes on a new meaning or a new potential. Here's an example of an older community, kind of the older gridded downtown area. And as the community has expanded, it's kind of gone through some sprawl out into the suburban areas with the cul-de-sacs and more spread out neighborhoods. In doing so, it's eaten up quite a bit of this dark green native habitat, and it's eaten up a lot of this hatched landscape, which is supposed to represent agriculture, right? So instead of sprawl like this, you could imagine a development pattern that was more clustered. Same number of homes on this landscape, but a more clustered pattern which eats up less native habitat. It preserves some of this agriculture, which actually can act as a buffer against fire coming out of the wildlands in many cases. And it results in neighborhoods that are potentially easier to defend, right? A sparser set of homes actually may require one engine per home, whereas in these conditions, you can have fewer suppression resources per parcel or per residence. And this has a lot of ancillary benefits too. A lot of, it's easier to get energy to and wastes out of communities like this, and they have a lower carbon footprint and so on and so forth. Some additional measures for new development are available here. I can put it in the chat later if anybody's interested, but this is largely for new communities. There's lots and lots of homes out there that are already built, right, in hazardous places and in vulnerable ways. So I'll spend a couple minutes on what I'm calling a regional wildfire mitigation program. Many people will be familiar with a community wildfire protection plan, a CWPP. CWPPs are designed, or the goal of a CWPP is to prioritize where different kinds of fuel treatments should go in a given community. It's really a fuel break or fuel treatment prioritization process, but it does bring the community together, and there is some education in the process. They tend to work well in forested environments. They tend to be more, the potential for them to be more controversial exists in shrubland environments. But this is one recognized tool that communities use to move forward. I would argue that CWPPs leave a lot left unaddressed. And so I have advocated for a program that is based on sort of 3 domains or 3 prongs. One is the landscape here, not just the fuel breaks, but assessing where on the landscape and along the wildland-urban interface we could preserve some agriculture as a buffer, or we could reinstate some agriculture in those areas to recreate a mosaic along the wildland-urban interface. Or maybe we can think a little bit more outside the box and imagine other public-private partnerships to put higher foliar moisture land covers on some of these areas. Imagine community orchards or gardens, green belts, basically somehow knitting back together a mosaic of higher foliar moisture parcels along the wildland-urban interface to recreate a buffer that used to exist in many communities but is now gone. On the built environment side, I have structures here, but really I think it applies to all parts of the built environment to map, assess, and prioritize structure retrofits. We mentioned wood roofs and ember-proof vents, but also the water supply. How many neighborhoods have water supplies that are insufficient? How many neighborhoods have road networks that are really problematic for evacuation, and so on? And how to mitigate and retrofit those problems. And then the people, how to educate and train the people. One program that we're going to explore here locally in the Santa Barbara area is the Firewise USA program that NFPA organizes. How to basically take the people and have them understand that they're living on a fire-prone landscape and what to do about it. So addressing these 3 prongs in a holistic and consistent way of mapping the assets at risk, looking at the hazard and the vulnerabilities to come up with an assessment of risk, prioritizing the mitigation, and having a social justice and a vulnerable communities aspect to it, and then coming up with a way to implement a very broad scale set of mitigation activities is what we're actually embarking on here locally soon. And lest this be, sometimes I've been told, oh, this is just a California perspective, right? And actually, there is pretty good support for this. This paper is a good example of that. The names on this paper are, Forest Service, establishment Forest Service thinking. Very smart people, but also very much in the fire behavior and forest science, fire science mentality. A quote out of this paper is telling: overcoming perceptions of the wildland-urban interface fire disasters as a wildfire control problem rather than a home ignition problem will reduce home loss. Basically, they're arguing the same thing that I was trying to point out earlier, that there's a forest fire problem and a fire control problem, and it's actually really distinct from the home loss and home ignition problem. And I'll end it with that, and I don't know if we want to have questions now, Nikki. There's 5 minutes or so, I guess, but
Yeah, I think we even have
or we can save them to the
9 minutes.
9. Okay, I have that I've been talking for 40 minutes, but maybe
Well,
timer's
we'll use 6.5.
All right. Okay.
There are 3 questions, but thank you so much. That was a lot of information. I can see you've spent quite some dedication figuring this out, and it's also quite pressing. So I'll ask the first question. Fritz Carlson says, how is human contribution, in quotes, to fire count quantified? What are the specific data that are included?
Very good question. So in the models that I was showing there, we had road densities and housing densities and distance to public lands included in the model. And we basically have maps of those variables, just like we have maps of you know, actual evapotranspiration or drought stress. More recently, we've looked at the importance of the power line infrastructure, actually having those mapped, having that mapped network into as an input. Turns out it was not terribly influential in the models that we were building. It's possible that that's because these are fire frequency models. And if we had a different kind of variable that we were trying to predict, like home losses or fire sizes or something like that, we would have some different variables popping out as important. But those are the kinds of anthropogenic variables that we have, mostly having to do with development density on the landscape in one metric or the other.
All right, thank you. The next question is, do heat islands have much to do with global warming?
Well, I don't think I'm the best person to answer that, but heat islands are from what I know of the term, it's referring to a lot of the concrete and asphalt that we have associated with developed areas, right? And that heats up and it retains heat into the evening when normally the place would cool down and it stays warmer. I think the potential for heat islands to retain more heat and stay warmer longer in a warmer world is certainly possible, but I don't think I know enough to speak more than that.
Sabrina, did you want to say something on that?
I don't really have an answer except to say that certainly the urban heat island effect can be exacerbated by global warming in terms of who's feeling it and who's exposed to higher heat, and especially in vulnerable communities. I don't know that there's much evidence that it's contributing to global warming.
All right. Yeah, if you need more clarification for the person that asked that, please let us know. The next question, I want to get these in. In the anthropogenic data, do you allow for a forecast in the models for humans to become more efficient at fighting future major fires?
Oh, good question. Not directly, and that is actually not a bad idea. But that would be included in the model indirectly via, I think one of the assumptions, one of the interpretations is that higher and higher development densities inherently have better and better fire suppression forces associated with them. And so that drop off in fire probabilities with higher densities just naturally occurs as a function of that pattern. But the idea that as in the future, we might have actually better tools or unique abilities to put out fires, no, we don't have any knowledge of that, and we don't incorporate that into the models right now.
Thank you. Next question. What degree would fuel reduction be achieved by wood-fired power plants and/or wood stoves? maybe to what degree would fuel reduction be achieved by wood-fired power plants?
Again, I'm not the person for that. There's a huge push in California to utilize biomass and to have that as part of the solution to helping out in places where we have overstocked forests. So I don't know the degree to which the potential for that could be realized, but I know there are people in our own organization studying it.
I am going to ask these second two questions before your time's out, because I think one of them might be addressed by Sabrina later, but are seasonal wind events included in fire models?
Not generally, because we don't have good maps of where and how often, how strong those seasonal wind events are likely to occur. But with the new fire hazard severity zone maps being rolled out by CAL FIRE, there is a whole new set of modeled wind that we may be able to use to actually finally do that.
Okay. So the next question, sadly, it appears not many Southern California attendees are here or participating in the research at large. Correct me, or please indicate how Southern California can be more involved, or how can a potential buyer into an existing forest community seek the best guidance for an affordable and safe structure for the land? And she has a second part in her question. Any comments on planned forest suppression burns and in terms of them adding to the climate extremes?
That's a large question. I think actually, well, I'm in Southern California, and I have plenty of colleagues down here that are studying these problems. So hopefully maybe we're not as visible or loud as we could or should be. The UCA&R has a fire website, which has actually a lot of good info on landscaping and on fire resistant building.
And I'll be talking about that.
Okay, great.
Later as well.
Yes.
I'll shut up.
Sabrina will be talking about that. Let's go to this next question. Are seasonal wind events included in fire models? Oh, we did that one already. No, we didn't. Oh, here.
You did. You just had to click done. Thank you.
I didn't hit done. Okay, the next. What are the roles of federal, state, local, and private entities in wildfire hazard mitigation?
Well, let's see. I think most of the resources that actually come from those various sources, most of those are available through the fire safe councils that are local organizations that are made up often of fire agency folks, but often homeowners and other NGOs. But the fire safe councils are a great place to start to look for resources coming from those different sources to actually get projects done locally, whether it be a chipping day or a fuel defensible space around a home or a fuel treatment or what have you.
Great. I think that we're going to leave the remaining one question for the end, and we're going to switch gears here to Matthew. Hello, Matthew.
Hello, Nikki.
So thank you again, Dr. Moritz. Thank you for that. And yes, we are here in Southern California. So next up is Matthew Shapiro. He leads the Livestock and Range Program in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. This program addresses issues related to the management of rangeland ecosystems, including wildlife habitat, invasive plants, wildland fire, prescribed fire, soil health, and watershed health. So with that, Matthew, take it away.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Is everyone hearing me and you can see my screen okay?
You're great, Matthew.
Good. Yep.
Great, thank you. I was asked this afternoon to provide sort of a short presentation that addressed fire, wildfire, and rangelands. And Max really beautifully sort of captured the full sweep of wildfire, both from a global all the way to a local scale. I'm really focusing on the south central coast here today. For those of you who are maybe not in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties, I hope it still feels relevant, or at least some of the concepts and themes will be. I like starting with this image in part because it sort of turns on its head, a scene that you might otherwise be familiar with. So many of us drive up and down the 101 or across the 126, and this is me standing on a ranch, a cattle ranch up in the hills above the city of Santa Paula. And so in the distance there, if you can see my cursor, there's the Santa Clarita Valley, there's South Mountain, there's the Santa Monica Mountains. But just to emphasize the fact that so much of the land that surrounds these areas, these really urbanized areas, that there is a tremendous amount of wildland area around it. And so much of that wildland area is managed actively through livestock agriculture. And ultimately it's livestock agriculture, mostly cattle in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties, get impacted significantly during wildfire events that happen quite regularly. And for those who are maybe unfamiliar with some of the terminology, I thought it's always useful to sort of start with definitions, but we've got a lot of rangeland in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties, and I'll focus on Ventura for the purpose of this conversation. It's a medium-sized land county in California with just over 1 million acres, and a tremendous amount of it is in rangeland, over 80%. Now, not all rangeland is grazed, and there's a sort of technical difference there, which range is distinct from rangeland, and that range is what is actually grazed. Ventura, as a percent of the county as the whole, is about 17% of the total land mass of Ventura County is actually grazed. And again, predominantly by cattle, although there are some sheep and goat operations. And I want to sort of make this a little more visual with some maps. And so here you can see Ventura and Santa Barbara counties, Ventura to the east, Santa Barbara to the west. That area in green is the administrative boundaries of Los Padres National Forest as they cross through these two counties. And the one point it's not entirely accurate, and I don't mean to paint too broad of a stroke, but Los Padres is largely a chaparral shrubland vegetation type. In most places, sort of hard chaparral, chamise dominated, which is distinct from coastal sage scrub, which exists, of course, in the forest, but also is much more common outside the forest to the south and to the east. And this yellow color that comes up is grazed lands as defined by the Department of Conservation in California. And it's not entirely accurate, but it is the best sort of spatial representation of where we know that there is some domestic livestock grazing. Now, again, there are some areas that are here in yellow that maybe don't anymore or haven't for some time had grazing on them, but it's a pretty good representation of where livestock exist in our two counties. And so I've got to move my Zoom screens a little bit, but in Ventura County here, you see, the Santa Clarita Valley, the Santa Clara River Valley here, the Oxnard Plain, and a tremendous amount of grazing, a fifth of the county in total, surrounding those areas. Now, this next image was rather stunning and striking to me, and I imagine to you too. This is in red with white polygon outlines. You see all wildfires as CAL FIRE lists them dating back to the last part of the 19th century. So for all effective purposes, this is the vast majority of wildfires as they've existed over the last century. The parts for me that are so striking is that all of the grazing land that exists in Ventura County and a significant portion of Santa Barbara County has burned. And I think the thread that I'd like to sort of tease out of the presentation that Daniel Swain gave on Tuesday afternoon is that wildfire is not a new problem. It's not a new issue. in this part of California and this part of the world. And in fact, and I'm about to sort of turn to how it impacts livestock agriculture, but the point being that cattle operations and agriculture generally, I'd say, especially including based on Ben Faber's presentation yesterday, are really accustomed to dealing with wildfire. Perhaps what is happening, and it was described by Daniel and others, is that the pace, frequency, and scale of those fires are increasing, but only just to say that there's a certain element of agriculture which I think is able to absorb the impacts, that, or at least they've been accustomed to them over decades. And the question now is, how does agriculture evolve to deal, domestic livestock agriculture in this case, evolve to deal with more frequent fire and maybe more intense and larger fires. So there you see the outline of the Thomas Fire, which was, for me personally, a watershed moment in my career with UC-ANR. It happened just a few months after I started in my position as the livestock and range advisor in the county. And so it's really driven a lot of my thinking and a lot of my research in the last couple of years. Here you can see just the footprint of the Thomas Fire, where it burned in the Los Padres. And then again, maybe more importantly for the purposes of this conversation, where it burned grazing lands and where mostly cattle were present when it did burn. There's that image zoomed in. And I'll just note, I hope you can see my cursor, here's the 150 linking Santa Paula and Ojai, of course, the ignition source for the Thomas Fire. And this very large area, up to 80,000 acres that burned in the first night of the Thomas Fire. So rapidly moving fire, rapidly moving across these cattle ranches, and gave producers really very little time to respond and react. But what does fire actually look like on the ground on these operations? And this is an image from the morning after the Thomas Fire burned through this particular ranch in Ventura County. A few days later on that same ranch, one of the things that I want to emphasize is just sort of the inconsistent spatial impact of wildfire across rangelands. You see areas of grassland that burned, areas that didn't. This was formerly a coastal sage scrub habitat, burned with a higher intensity, a little more uniformly. And here we see a north-facing slope, likely an oak woodland or sort of heavier shrubland vegetation type, burned at a much higher intensity and more completely and uniformly. And so what are the impacts from wildfire on these livestock operations? Perhaps the one that everyone thinks about first, of course, is lost livestock. And this is absolutely true. Given the speed that these wildfires move and sometimes the lack of warning, a lot of these cattle producers, livestock producers don't have the ability to really even make contact with their livestock before fire moves through these ranches. And so as a result, they're left to defend barns and homes and critical infrastructure around the home place, but not even necessarily be able to round up and move livestock out of the area. Producers lose dry forage from the previous spring's growth. And then, of course, the fire itself, the sort of biophysical impacts of the fire impacts future forage production. And I don't want to belabor this point too much, but I think it does bespeak sort of the double whammy impact that fires have on livestock producers. Here is a sort of a representation of how annual annual grasses function in sort of a range context. And you can see in October, where we sort of, in theory, get our first rains, although it's increasingly more December and January. That dark line represents live growth, and then the hatched line represents growth from the previous year that producers still rely on to feed their livestock well into the following winter. One of the pieces that was so devastating about the Thomas Fire was that so many producers, even though we hadn't had a germinating rain, and we didn't have green forage on the ground at the time of the Thomas Fire, for example, there was still quite a bit of dead forage that producers were relying on. And so we're immediately substantially impacted when the fire moved through. Infrastructure damage, of course. And so, hundreds, each individual ranch, considering that they're frequently 2, 5, 10,000 acres in size, have miles and miles of fencing, of pipeline, water infrastructure, all of which is substantially or catastrophically damaged, leading to hundreds of thousands of dollars of cash that needs to be outlaid. So you have this disruption to the cash flow, both from lost livestock and from the capital improvement outlays you need to provide. And then sort of lastly, this more ineffable loss, which is the genetic loss of cattle. And so many of these operations across California depend on cattle that have been raised and bred and adapted to their particular ranch. And when you either lose cattle or need to ship or sell cattle because you lose feed, it takes years, and the impact is years long. So, how do ranchers respond, or how will they be responding? As I described, sometimes with fire, there's very little ability for them to respond at all, given the speed and the scale of the fire. Increasingly ranchers are recognizing the threat that, the increased threat of wildfire, developing plans to address it. I'm going to talk on the next slide a little bit about the Ag Pass, but it's a program that actually Max Moritz and I have been working on along with so many others across the state to help producers, both livestock and row crop and orchard producers, respond to fire while it's happening. And then after fire, what are folks forced to do? They either have to sell animals or buy feed. Typically purchasing feed doesn't pencil out. Things to consider, such as range seeding, actually supplanting or rather supplementing the seed bank, because fire does measurably have impacts to range production in future years. And then this idea of local, state, and federal emergency relief programs, which exists for so many other sectors of the economy and exists for agriculture, and even specifically livestock agriculture. Some of the issues include the programs are not well tailored to California, the timing of the programs such that the cash flow comes significantly later, almost make them or reduce the positive impact that they may otherwise have. Quickly, the Ag Pass, the basic concept is that it would allow producers, agricultural producers, through roadblocks during wildfire, not when there's imminent danger, and not to provide aid, to fire suppression aid, but instead, once the fire has moved through and the road closures remain, to get back to their animals, to evacuate, to get back to their farms or orchards, to irrigate. And it's one way that we might think about dampening and making these operations more resilient to fire, because a lot of the losses that do come happen sort of are administrative or human caused, if you will, because of some of the decisions that fire professionals need to make in the natural course of fighting fire. I want to end, I guess, just by sort of asking why does this matter? And Max touched on this a little bit in his presentation just a few minutes ago, but and I've mentioned the fact that especially livestock agriculture in Ventura County really surrounds these urban areas. And many of us may think that why does livestock agriculture and the cattle industry matter to maintain? Fire, regular fire impacting these companies have the ability to put a lot of these guys out of business. And I suppose my concluding point is that agriculture has this really unique ability to buffer urban and woolly areas across our state. And this is an image of fire intensity during the Thomas Fire. Black represents lower intensity burns and white higher intensity burns. And this plays out sort of numerically, where you can see that during the Thomas Fire, the total fire perimeter, these were the fire severity bins by percentage. But if you narrow that down just to grazed lands, that the fire intensity is significantly less severe on grazed lands, and grazed lands surrounded a lot of really critical areas of Ventura County, less so in Santa Barbara County. But I just want to encourage us to think about how grazing and supporting livestock operations across the state to be more resilient to wildfire has this sort of feedback to help make the state potentially more resilient to wildfire more generally, and dampen the impacts to urban and woolly areas. So I think I've run through my time.
Yeah, we have gone over just 1 minute though. So we're gonna switch gears. Thank you for that presentation. That was amazing. A lot of work in there. We're gonna switch to Sabrina's presentation and we're gonna save some of these really good questions until after she's done. So it's now my honor to introduce Dr. Sabrina Drill. She's the Natural Resources Advisor for UC Cooperative Extension in Los Angeles and Ventura counties in Southern California. And she runs the Sustainable and Fire Resistant Homes and Landscape Program, which is the acronym SAFER. So she's going to tell you more about that. Take it away. Thank you, Sabrina.
Great. Hi.
Sabrina,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Sabrina, can you click on the display settings at the top and change it to switch, swap, just swap? There, whoops.
Yes or no?
That's, no, something's happened. Because we only see half of your slideshow.
Worse?
Can you go to
I
display
thought better
settings
or worse?
again?
What?
It's worse. Can you go to display settings? And did you click on swap or duplicate? No,
I
that's,
clicked on swap.
try duplicate and see if something happened.
I'm trying to. There's something on all the Zoom stuff is in the way. Better?
Yes, that's perfect, except we can, okay, no, that's good, I think.
Okay, I can also do a different screen share.
It's a little narrow, but it's not. Now you're not in presentation mode.
Okay. I wasn't sure if it was going to change out. All right.
Not yet, back again. So go to display settings and do whatever, duplicate, I think.
Yeah.
There you
Okay.
go.
All right. It also turned on my captioning again. Oh, I can turn that off. Okay, great. So all good now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm actually, as one of the people who sort of put the schedule together, I'm pleased because I feel like we're kind of honing down and we've ended each day a little bit with sort of a more of what you can do at an individual level, especially if you're not a rancher, if you're a homeowner. And so I'm going to talk about building fire resilience in the WUI. Except it's not now going to let me change slides. Okay. So as we talked about before, you know, we're definitely seeing changes in fire regime, and I'm not going to get sort of into the details that Daniel and Max have already presented, but we know that there are changes in fire regime due to climate change, due to human-caused ignition, and I include electrical system failure in that as well, and due to fuels management, although it plays out differently in Southern California than it does in Northern California. But the other thing that Daniel alluded to a little bit too is the role of invasive species. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that. So invasive species, there's some misunderstanding sometimes about this, but they're species who are non-native to an ecosystem and whose introduction causes economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. This is basically the legal federal definition of an invasive species. And I think it's important to just note that we're not talking about all non-native species here. They have to be species for whom this negative impact is proven. Generally, they're adapted to local climatic conditions. That's kind of a problem when we think about climate change, because we're dealing with a whole bunch of different things together, right? We're dealing with fire, which we're focusing in on today. We're dealing with drought, and we're dealing potentially with flooding, as Daniel talked about as well. So there's a lot of importance to thinking about having drought tolerant plants, but if you're using drought tolerant plants, you can be prone to using plant species that are going to be invasive because they survive well outside of that home managed zone where supplemental water is available. So they can thrive really in local climatic conditions, and they're often, not often, they usually come without their predators or grazers or whatever would keep them under control in their native habitat. So how does this relate to fire? So invasive plants simply can increase the amount and continuity of fuels. And we'll be talking a lot more about continuity of fuels in a bit. But what that really means is they're filling in the gap. So if you think about a typical Southern California chaparral or other kinds of shrublands, you've got plants that are separated usually by granitic soils to some degree. And what happens with these annual grasses in particular, but other weedy plants as well, is that they just fill in all of those spaces so that flames can spread more easily across that landscape. Another interaction is that over clearance. So when people are clearing areas around their properties with the idea of being improving their fire resilience, they're actually causing disturbance, and that can cause a spread of invasive plants. And the last piece, and sort of bringing it all together, is that these invasive plants can lead, and their impact on fire can lead to type conversion and biodiversity loss. And by type conversion, I mean the change from one kind of habitat to another. And it's this vicious cycle here where invasive plants come in, you have these more continuous fuel beds that can result in an increase in fire frequency and severity. And that means even though a lot of our native plants are considered to be fire adapted, eventually you're losing all of the energy that is underground in those stored seeds and in the roots that allow a lot of our plants to be resprouters. They just get exhausted. Then you have these holes that are more prone to invasive plants, and the fire just keeps going. And the last thing, which is really more on the human dimension side of thing, is that invasive plants can escape from fire-safe landscapes. And there's a lot of lists of plant species, plants that are recommended by nurseries, by fire departments, that actually promote the use of invasive species. One example here, ice plant, this is what they call highway ice plant, was recommended for a long time as being something that's fire resilient because it has these nice green fleshy parts that hold on to a lot of moisture even when there's little water availability. Well, it turns out that these actually grow across areas like sand dunes where normally you wouldn't have a lot of vegetation. You now have these fuel loads, and underneath this nice green surface layer, they can have all of this dry, dead thatch. So you can see fires actually spreading almost underneath the ground, hidden away and spreading to new areas. So the way that we approach this, starting after the devastating fires in 2007 throughout Southern California, was to develop this program called Sustainable and Fire Resistant. And the idea is to improve fire resilience in the WUI areas, but also to protect the health of neighboring wildlands by addressing this issue of fire-resistant gardens becoming a source for this harmful environmental mechanism of plant invasion. So I'll come back to that in a little bit, but first I just want to kind of give you some of the basics of fire-resistant landscapes. And one of the things that I think Max kind of alluded to this earlier, the idea that we sort of look out at the wildlands or we look out at fire as being the problem. And what we really need to do is turn around and look at what we're building and how we're building it. You really need to think about fire resistant landscapes starting at the structure and making modifications to the structures themselves to make them less flammable and less prone to ember intrusion. And I'll talk about that on the next slide a little bit. And then in terms of vegetation, thinking about location and maintenance and how you're planting things and how you're spacing them very near the home. This is more important really than what you're doing, you know, in that 30 to 70 foot zone where you're supposed to be doing brush clearance. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. I did drop something in the chat, and there's a link on the fire website, and there's a link on my website that I'll show in the towards the end of the talk about home hardening. But really, it comes from this idea that sources of ignition of homes in a wildfire, you can have direct flame contact, but most of the time it's these windblown embers. And most of our fires in Southern California and throughout the state are really wind-driven events. And that means you get these ember storm fronts that can be a mile beyond where you actually have flames. So all of this is kind of thinking about what are the building materials I use that can be resistant to fire in terms of siding, in terms of roofing materials, but also how do I make sure that fire isn't being transmitted to my home through wood fences and attachments, and that embers aren't entering the home through things like vents and windows. So after we move out from the home, the next zones we kind of think about are the zones of defensible space. And what defensible space comes from, and Max used this term earlier, is the idea of what can we do to make homes more fire resistant on their own, but also what can we do to give firefighters a chance to defend a structure successfully and safely. This is a little bit new. So for years, we've been talking about defensible space in terms of zones 1 and 2, which I'm going to come back to in a minute, near home and further away from the home. But we're finding that what's really important is to focus a lot of attention on what we're calling zone 0 now, 0 to 5 feet from the home, and really making sure that that is thought of as a non-combustible zone. So not using wood mulches or rubber mulches that are combustible, other wood materials, not piling your firewood right up against the home, moving furniture away from the home, and thinking about replacing that with things like concrete and gravel and things that aren't combustible, and maybe some low ground covers, some flower beds and that kind of thing. This comes back to, trying to be concerned about drought and fire at the same time. A lot of people are thinking about putting in rain barrels. A lot of the rain barrels that you can easily purchase from a home improvement store or from programs that actually municipalities will have are plastic. Occasionally they're wood. And you're putting them where the gutters are going to go. And you really have to think about what those materials are. So it might be better to replace those combustible materials with something that's combustion resistant. It might not store your water in the same form you're used to, but it could increase your groundwater supplies and reduce the need for water applications. Zone 1, this is, what things we've been talking about for a long time, the lean and green zone, where your goal is really to reduce the connectivity of fuels, so that you're not able to, again, transmit fire right up to the structure. And you're not producing a lot of embers that come from crown fires high up in the trees as opposed to lower fires. All of this has to do with the idea of creating horizontal and vertical separation of things. So you don't have this fuel ladder kind of phenomenon right here, but you have space under trees, under vegetation, and then spacing your plantings apart so that they can't just directly transmit flame. Zone 2 is just kind of an extension of that, but you can start to have a little more vegetation out here. You want to reduce behavior of an approaching fire. If you could move a canopy fire down to the ground, it's much less destructive, easier to control, and it's not producing the same amount of embers. Having small clumps of shrubs or trees, again, well spaced apart, and then really thinking about your maintenance. And this is something that I want to hit. Oh, I do want to mention that, it's hard. You can't come up all the time with an exact measurement, and the distances that we're talking about have to be adjusted for slope. And you can work with your fire department to really get a better sense of what these distances should be on your property. I also want to come back to this idea of brush clearance. So I like to talk about conducting reasonable fire hazard reduction. We don't want a moonscape. And the term brush clearance really is falling out of favor, thankfully, because it's misleading. Brush, it kind of has a negative connotation, but what we're really talking about is native habitat. And clearance sounds like you should clear everything, but what you really want to do is have selective removal and thinning, especially of dead materials, out of the way and just producing that space again. More isn't better. Going out further from the house is not really going to protect you much from embers. And it's not just fire, right? It's this whole cycle of fire and flood. Overclearing can cause erosion, and bare earth can promote these plant invasions. And this becomes, not just sort of an ecological, or not just an environmental concern, but a real concern when people are doing, their vegetation management in the early spring. Of course, today we're finding out certainly that these fire seasons are longer, and early spring is part of fire season now, it would seem, in Southern California. But this is an area where, you do this in June and these annual grasses come in, they germinate, they grow, they die. And by October, when Santa Ana events start to pick up, it's just more dead fuel. You also want to avoid these donut holes. There's a house in here. And clearly what they did is they were more concerned about this zone than what was happening right next to the structure. I do want to talk a bit about plant choice. We in cooperative extension are really resistant to recommending people look at plant lists. And that's because any plant, except for a metal one, like I'm showing right here, can burn under the right conditions. And there's no consistent rating system for flammability. So occasionally you see that a nursery or some other group has gone out and set a bunch of plants on fire, and they'll tell you which ones are more flammable, but those aren't under the kinds of conditions we see precedent to a fire, when you won't be able to water, when these winds are picking up with incredibly low humidity, just sucking vegetation out of every plant. So that brings us back to the idea again that maintenance is much more important than plant choice. You can, however, do a few things. You can choose slow growing and drought resistant plants so that you have less work to do in that maintenance. Note that water applied at the last minute is not going to compensate for poor maintenance. A dead plant is fuel, whether it's because of underwatering or overwatering, hearkening back to what Ben said about, most of the issues he sees is overwatering or underwatering. And I want to point out that you can accomplish multiple goals. So you can have ocean-friendly or native or pollinator-friendly fire-resistant gardens. You just have to be a little bit careful about how you go about it. And that is my last slide. Hopefully there's plenty of time for questions now.
I guess I just want to, for those people who have to leave at this point, before we go into the extended question and answer session, I do want to express my gratitude to the excellent speakers and also for keeping on time. It's been very, very informative. I think we all learned a lot. I also want to thank our moderators, Sabrina Drill on the first day, Matthew Shapiro yesterday, and Nikki Anderson today. And the organizing committee, which is Sabrina, Matthew, Nikki, and Susanna Brazone Miller. Furthermore, I want to thank Patricia Rodriguez and Pam Can-Rice for help with publicity, and Sherry Cooper and her team from the A&R Program Support Unit for their expert assistance. So thank you also to the audience for your great attention, participation, and great questions. I know you've been listening intently. And we hope that you found the webinar series educational, and we hope you will fill out the post-event survey, which will help us in organizing future events. So I'll just turn it over now back to Nikki, and thank you so much.
And
Thank you,
Sherry, could you drop that survey link into the chat?
Sure.
Well, I know
and it will also open when people close their Zoom.
I know, Max, you have to leave. Did you want to try to answer that one question about CAL FIRE, or should I can just, the answer you messaged me, I can relay. The question for the audience is, do you work with CAL FIRE? Are they prepared for this summer in California?
I know they're worried about this summer in California. I don't work with any of the suppression or response folks. The models that I showed you do feed into some of their internal programs and decision making. So I do work with them, but not in the response and suppression side. But I have heard a lot of concerns over the coming summer.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, we'll see you next time, Max. Thank you. Thank you, Sabrina, for that wonderful presentation. I know that it really helps people to see those diagrams and to see actual ways that they can protect their homes, because it can feel so powerless when a fire comes through. So thank you. And we thank you to everyone involved. Just as Annemiek said, if you need to go, we understand, go cook dinner. But for those who want to stay, we're going to get through these questions here. And these were from your session, Matthew. So I'll just start right off. The first question, how deep does fire affect the seed bank? And this actually could go to Sabrina as well. How deep does fire affect the seed bank? And what is the primary recolonizer? Is there a subsequent need to control in some manner invasives? So we did mention a little bit about that, but do you want to take a stab at it, Matthew?
Sure, and I think I can provide something of an answer. The question does extend, I think, beyond the scope of my expertise, but in short, the easy answer for me to give is it's really variable, right? And so you're talking both about the fire behavior itself and differences in impact, but then also in vegetation. I think I've thought about this question in one of two contexts where I think it's interesting or important to think about it. With my persuasion towards agriculture and livestock production, I think about seed bank in the context of forage for grazing animals, and in our instances in Ventura County on the Central Coast, sort of annual grasslands. But of course, there's the equally important, if not more important, question, sort of ecologically speaking, thinking about native habitat recovery, native species recovery, in addition to forage at that. And then again, as I said, it sort of depends on the sort of fire that burns through the certain kind of vegetation. I did a soil seed bank study after the Thomas fire, where I looked at different burn intensities, took soil cores and potted them out in greenhouses and watered them and counted seed germination by functional group. And there was a really clear threshold between what I qualitatively described as high severity fire versus low and moderate severity fire. And there was a suggestion that for ranchers who were interested in supplementing their forage the following year, that it made sense to seed what they wanted to seed in areas that had burned at high intensity. Now, that study didn't look at the sort of mechanisms or drivers for why there was that reduction, whether it was, in some instances, where there was high severity fire, that was a shrubland community, there was more fuel to burn, it burned hotter, and so perhaps scorched the seed bank at a greater depth. But also it's conceivable that there was sort of just less herbaceous seeds underneath a shrubland canopy, sort of a thing. And I don't want to take too much time, but I'll say one last thing just in terms of sort of management of invasives post-fire. One, I think, interesting hypothesis that I'm beginning to investigate is this notion that post-fire grazing, extensive post-fire grazing, meaning non-intensive grazing, can maybe have really positive benefits to native species recovery. And I'm thinking specifically in helping support native shrubs recover. Grazers are very selective in the plants that they eat. Cattle in particular prefer herbaceous or grassy plants over shrubby ones. Many of the native shrubs are actually non-palatable to them. And so if you actually intentionally add grazing post-fire, the hypothesis I would offer is that they select invasive non-native grass species for consumption and do not consume the native shrub species, and thereby potentially expediting recovery. More work and research needs to go into that. I haven't seen in the literature, evidence of that, but I think it's an interesting hypothesis to offer.
Thank you.
And I will say, I don't have an answer to how deep in the seed bank. Like Matthew said, it depends on what was the pre-existing vegetation. It depends on the intensity of the burn itself. It depends on the geology, right? And the soil types that are present there and how deep how deep those go and what kind of slopes you have, because that'll affect how much soil is built up there. But I will certainly say that, yes, there's often a need to address invasive species after a fire. One of the great things about wildland fire, and of course this applies to prescribed fire as well, which can be used to control invasive weeds, is that you're kind of starting from a blank slate. So if you have an environment that was highly disturbed, that was full of invasive weeds to begin with, and now you just have sort of scorched earth, you could go back in and selectively try to manage those invasive weeds, often grasses, and you could do that with certain techniques. You could do it with certain herbicides, you could do it with grazing, and give a advantage to the native species as they recover. I will say, I don't think this was the question, but one of the really neat things, and the picture behind me is a picture I took at Arroyo Seco Arroyo Verde Park after the Thomas fire. One of the first colonizers that I saw in that area was Mara, wild cucumber. And I thought, I'm actually not a botanist, but I thought it would be really interesting to kind of look at that, because it is usually a vine, but there wasn't much for it to be climbing up. And so it just spread across. And it seemed like it might have been creating a very protective surface for other plants that germinated later. So kind of an interesting idea there.
Cool, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. What kind of wildfire early warning system would serve ranchers in Southern California?
Again, it depends so much on the nature of the fire. Using the Thomas fire, because it's relatively recent and local, it moved so fast. I don't know that I don't think most producers, you could see the glow on the horizon before, phone calls reached you. But with that said, I think this is a bigger problem for California, just in terms of our communication systems and the way that cellular service breaks down. And so many of us are relying almost exclusively on that. And so it's a good question, because I don't know that the agricultural community more broadly and ranchers specifically have been thinking about sort of mutual aid communication systems in this way. And maybe it's worth spending time addressing.
Thank you. Okay, the next question. I'm a retired photojournalist and I've been covering fires in Ventura County since 1971. During that time, fires periodically burned the triangle between Fillmore, Santa Paula, Ventura, and Ojai, but took several days to burn that area. The Thomas fire burnt that area inside of 24 hours. What do you make of that?
Well,
I've been.
You want to start that?
You go for it, Sabrina.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I want to say that was really kind of unique about the Thomas fire was the wind speeds that were present, but also the duration of the wind event just prior to that fire was really unusually long. So things were like really preheated, and there'd been days and days of this incredibly low humidity, and then these winds came in and just whipped through fast. And I talked to a lot of just firefighters, fire professionals, who said they've never seen a fire move that fast, certainly in that area. And I will say, and I've been sort of beaten down by the atmospheric scientists a little bit on this, but I would really like to get into that wind research. I think wind is really understudied as a form of extreme weather, and as a factor in fires. And I wish Max was still here, because I kind of wanted to ask him. He's like, when we get these better wind models, we'll plug them in. And I kind of wanted to ask, who's working on these better wind models? Like, we really, I think, need to pay attention to that. Matthew, hand it over.
That was well put, Sabrina, and more or less the answer I was going to give. I would only just add, and this is pure speculation, so I'm a little loath to offer it, but if it was Bob arrived in 1971, there was a more proactive program, private and public, to complete vegetation management projects across the county and in on these ranches that have existed for over a century. Only just to say that, and I'm sensitive and want to pick back up the thread that Sabrina talked about. Sort of brush clearing is not ideal. It is what was practiced historically, and on ranches there was a lot of type conversion, and whether it be temporary or permanent, from shrubland to grassland types. I wonder if the sort of in 1971 fires behaved differently because there was a different history of vegetation management as opposed to 2017. I don't know if you want to correct that, Sabrina.
No, I think, and you probably have the numbers better down than I do, but certainly what I've heard from ranchers and from others in Ventura County is, yes, there was more proactive vegetation management. A lot of that was prescribed burning. And, that, as opposed to sort of the mow it all down, perhaps was more selective. So it's all of these things interacting, right? It's not any one thing. It's not the wind. It's not even the increase in temperature. It's not the development patterns. It's not changes in grazing. It's not invasive species. It's all of them together changing the system.
Really good point.
Z, all of the above.
Yeah.
Okay, this is for you, Sabrina. In zone 0, are vinyl fences non-combustible?
Well, I would need to know more about the vinyl, and I'm not really an expert in building materials. I did pop into the chat that guide to the Insurance Institute for Building and Safety. Anyway, whatever it is, that was the right link. And also in the California Fire Code 7A, they rate certain materials there, but generally, no, it isn't, or it is combustible. Vinyl can actually be really dangerous because it burns a little more slowly than a lot of other materials, and it like drips fire, so I would avoid it, but it really depends on exactly the building material that you're talking about. And a lot of my experience with that was with decks.
All right. The next question. My community has instituted a new mandatory policy to remove juniper plants. I've written that this is leading to a false sense of security and not focused on home hardening. What are best sources of science-based info on fire ignition of common landscape plants? I need a better argument to get the community to focus on home hardening and not just removal of certain plant species.
Well, I'm going to say that whatever might be the best source of science based on fire ignition of common landscape plants isn't that great, because again, these studies are hard, if not perhaps impossible to do. And you would have to do them with every one of these species under a myriad of conditions. But I would agree, I'll say this and sort of shout it from the rooftops, and my colleague Steve Quarles will say this, and Jack Cohen will say this, and a lot of other folks involved in this, that home hardening is where it's at. And trying to pick out any single species of plant as being the problem is not going to be nearly as effective as what can be expensive retrofits.
Yeah. So Mary Ellen King, if you're still listening, you can send them the recorded version of this talk as a start.
And I'd be happy to talk to you more about it. And I dropped my email into the chat as well.
Thank you, Sabrina. Mm-hmm. Next question. When I attended a fire safe presentation, they said CAL FIRE wants no trees within 20 feet of the structures. That would eliminate most trees in my neighborhood. What are your thoughts on that, Sabrina?
Well, again, I don't know your neighborhood. I don't know the topography of your neighborhood, which has a lot to do with this. But I will say that if there are trees within 20 feet of structures, they need to be limbed away so that there aren't any overhanging branches within 10 feet of the structures. And those trees need to be well maintained and pruned up.
All right. Done. The next question. How does cattle grazing impact the viability of natives?
Yeah, this is a big question that's almost separate from the wildfire one. There are a lot of different natives, of course, both herbaceous and shrub natives, and I think grazing and herbivory impact them differently. As I mentioned a few moments ago, there's good evidence that cattle grazing in particular largely avoids a lot of many native shrub species, which is a benefit to maintaining their vigor and presence on the landscape. That's not to say that there aren't other impacts. You know, there can be physical ones just from trampling and walking. Frequently can open up coastal sage scrub habitat, for example, in ways that would be more dense if grazing wasn't present. But then there's a lot of herbaceous natives that cattle can negatively impact if grazing is done inappropriately or non-strategically. But there's a whole body of literature across California that suggests that for certain species of native plants, that cattle grazing can actually have a real benefit. So, you know, it sort of gets back to, you know, this: what are your targets, what are your goals and objectives, and what species are you really trying to manage? There's not a one size fits all answer.
Okay, thank you. The next question is actually, the next two questions are one question.
I saw them about Trex.
Yes, is Trex material a good alternative to wood and vinyl?
So again, I will have to admit that I am not an expert on the composition of building materials. I do know that Trex decking material is not necessarily better than, say, cedar, which is fairly fire resistant, or sorry, redwood, which is fairly fire resistant. But generally it's considered to be a Class C material. I think Trex has some patents on their materials, and I don't think every Trex product is the same composition. I guess I'm ducking the question because I don't have the answer exactly, but generally Trex is not considered to be a better alternative than, say, redwood.
Thank you. So this last, it's not a question, it's more of a comment, but in SoCal suburban areas, in Southern California, suburban areas have burned extensively. I wish that UCANR Fire in California, Preparing Your Home, had a section about fence materials. Need to get big box stores and home improvement services to offer non-combustible fences for suburban homeowners who live in adjacent lots with 6-foot setbacks from property line.
That is a very specific question. I will take that under advisement. We probably could have better materials about that. I will say that where fencing comes right up to a home, it's preferable to have a metal gate separate that fencing material from your home. But it goes back right to some of the things that Max was saying about whether existing homes that directly abut I'm sorry, I'm not doing well with words hard right now. But, you know, the idea that if you have roadways around a community and you don't just have those backyards abutting right up to where the fire risk is going to be coming from, that you can have better buffers there. But yeah, there's not a lot of space in these existing communities. I don't have an answer to what should be done, but I will take under advisement that there could be more information in our materials about fencing, and I appreciate that.
Well, I don't see any more questions. You guys have any questions for each other? Oh, it just popped up.
Yes, in SoCal suburbs, fires jump the roads. This is true. You know, and they did the same thing in Northern California suburbs as well. These communities are never going to be completely fire resistant and fire safe.
Right.
We're trying to do the best we can, but that broader issue of land use and where a building should be permitted is something that we really need to be addressing.
Right. There's no one answer fits all here. A lot of different factors.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll say is, yes, fire jumped the road. You're not necessarily with defensible space trying to completely inhibit fire and allow the structures to stand on their own. But what roads can do is provide a staging area for firefighting activities.
Well, is there anything that anyone would like to add?
Thank you, Nikki, for fearlessly moderating this session.
Yes.
Oh yeah, it's been fun.
Well done. And I'll just put one more pitch in. If you liked what you heard here, yes, Hannah, the recordings will be available.
Yep.
I'll say that. I don't know that the slides by themselves will be made available because we're starting to be more cognizant of issues where, we want to be able to contextualize our information ourselves. But the recordings will be available. And I just want to say, yeah, if you like what you heard, please put it in the evaluation. Thank you, Nikki.
Yeah, one more plug for that evaluation.
Yeah.
It helps us so we can better serve you guys. So thanks to everyone who's been with us, especially for all 3 days, who's stuck it out this long, and on we go.
One more question came in, Nikki. I don't know if you want to address that.
I
Sorry.
don't think we have an answer to
There is.
Okay, no answer. Okay.
I'm looking at the question. There's going to be assembly bill presented about windmills in the ocean. I don't think our agency will be involved in that. ANR hasn't traditionally done a lot of work in the energy production arena, but it's something to look at. And I'll also say hi, Jill. One of our participants is a former member of my mom's group.
All right.
Go
Thanks,
ahead, Nikki.
everyone.
Thank you. I think we'll stop recording now and thank everybody and have a good day.